Hey there, and welcome to the Accretive Employee Benefits Compliance webinar. My name is Kevin Knopf, and I am Vice President of Communications for Keenan, an Accretive company. Today's webinar series is brought to you by Accretive. Accretive specializes in cost controlling solutions that encompass comprehensive enrollment services, medical stop loss programs, and pharmacy benefits management. This month, we are talking about the Affordable Care Act 15 years later. I'm excited today to be joined by my friend and colleague, Amy Donovan. Amy is the Senior Vice President and Chief Counsel of Employee Benefits Compliance at Accretive. She has more than 20 years of experience in employee benefits law and compliance, and she oversees the legal and regulatory affairs of our employee benefits division. Before we begin, I would like to remind you that this webinar is for informational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. You should consult your own legal counsel before taking any actions based on the information presented here. Also, please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be available on the Accretive website, as well as the Keenan website and many of our other Accretive company websites after the presentation. If you have any questions during the webinar, please type them in the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your screen, and we will attempt to answer those. Because Amy has so much to go over today, I don't know if we will have time to answer those questions live, but we will do our best to answer every question afterwards and post the Q&A on the websites. Amy, floor is yours.
Thanks, Kevin. So let's see if I can move to the next screen. Let's jump right into it. I do have a lot of slides and a lot of material to cover today. But I wanted to pause first and talk about why we have the ACA to begin with, right? So health coverage before the ACA. If you think back to 2009, lots of things were happening in pop culture. The TV show Modern Family premiered. Miley Cyrus had the #1 hit with Party in the USA. Bitcoin was launched. And so in many ways, 2009 doesn't feel like that long ago. And in many ways, it's been 15 years. So in the world of 2009 wasn't very different from today, but the number of uninsured Americans was climbing. There were 58.5 million Americans. That was almost 20% of Americans were uninsured for at least part of the year. The cost of group health premiums had more than doubled over 10 years. Out-of-pocket costs were rising as well. Required benefits in insured plans varied widely state by state, and there was no really easy way to compare coverage and costs from plan to plan. And in the individual market, a person's health history could be considered in enrollment and rating. So this was the world that had been in existence, certainly to a certain extent, when the Clintons attempted to enact a kind of healthcare reform when Bill Clinton was president. It's certainly the world into which Barack Obama came with a promise to do something about healthcare, to do healthcare reform. So the goals of the ACA were really threefold. First was to increase access to health insurance and reduce the number of the uninsured. 20%, 19.4% is a lot of people to not have any health coverage in this country at any given time. To also slow the growth of healthcare costs, right? Because they had been increasing so rapidly. So both the costs of coverage and the out-of-pocket costs for care. And also to improve the quality of care, both raise the quality of the coverage that was offered through the group and individual markets, and then improve health outcomes. So lots of really big goals as part of the ACA, and we're going to come back to this later and talk about whether these goals have been met. But first, we'll just quickly go over what the major provisions were of the Affordable Care Act. Most of the people on this call are well versed in this, so we won't dilly-dally. But so from an individual perspective, the things that changed once the ACA was fully implemented was that there was an individual mandate, right? And you have to report your individual coverage to the IRS. There was guaranteed issue, which meant there was no health underwriting. Coverage of preventive services without cost sharing, which is one of the most popular aspects of the ACA. Another incredibly popular aspect of the ACA, dependent coverage on a parent plan to age 26, before kids aged off at 18, 21. Expansion of coverage to 10 categories of essential health benefits, maximum out-of-pocket limits set by the government, and the summary of benefits and coverage requirement, which makes it easier for consumers to compare plans. So from an individual perspective, that's a good deal of what changed. From an employer perspective, there are a lot of new obligations. So the employer mandate, reporting, and penalty exposures for applicable large employers. The definition of a full-time employee at 30 hours a week of work for purposes of entitlement to an offer of health insurance. There's the PCORI fees for self-funded plans. That was a new tax that self-funded employers pay. All employers pay it, actually, but it gets paid through your premiums to fully insured plans for those of you who are fully insured. Premium rating rules based only on individual or family status, geography, age, and the age premium rating is limited to a 3-to-1 variation in premiums based on age and tobacco use. That's it. There are no other ways in which they can rate a plan, in which a health insurance company can rate a plan. The summary and benefit coverage requirement, it's clearly an obligation of the employer as well to provide new standards for premium rate reviews in the states, and the medical loss ratio requirement with a refund to contract holders. So the ACA put in place a standard that for large group health plans, 85% of premium dollars have to be spent on either quality aspects of the plan or care. And if the government finds that that you have not met that ratio, then refunds have to be made to contract holders. So those are writ large things that changed from the employer perspective. From the government perspective, and certainly this impacts individuals and employers as well, there were state-by-state marketplaces established with required outreach and enrollment assistance programs. And each of those got stood up in the various states by the state governments. To the extent that states did not set up their marketplaces, the federal government marketplace came in and became the marketplace for those states. There was the Medicaid expansion and the streamlined application process, and individual market premium tax credits and cost sharing reductions to drive down the price of coverage to individuals that were in the individual market. So those were the broad strokes of what the ACA did. And so immediately after the ACA became law, the challenges began to be filed. In fact, the ACA is the most challenged statute in American history. Since the enactment of the ACA, more than 2,000 lawsuits have been brought to challenge the law as a whole or portions of it, including 8 that have been heard by the Supreme Court to date. A statistic that the 2020 article by Georgetown Law Journal called staggering. The authors of that article observed that the litigation reveals the extensive reach of the ACA into all areas of the economy and its effects far beyond healthcare. It shows the legal complexity of a federal law that does not rely solely on the federal government to administer. Oops, let me go back. Of the federal government to administer, but relies on other sections of the economy as well. So it is enormously complicated, and those cases that reached the Supreme Court all have had an impact on how the law is able to effectuate the lawmakers' original goals. So let's talk about some of those challenges. There are three cases that that challenged really the law as a whole, the three big ACA legal challenges in the Supreme Court. The first one was heard in 2012. That's NFIB versus Sebelius. In that case, the Supreme Court upheld the individual mandate and the Medicaid expansion under Congress's taxing power. However, it made the Medicaid expansion not mandatory for states, which has had an enormous impact on how Medicaid expansion has been rolled out. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. In 2015, there was King versus Burwell, which upheld the eligibility for subsidies for consumers who bought coverage on a federally run exchange. The wording of the statute had said that people were eligible for subsidies when they bought coverage on these state exchanges. So the King v. Burwell case really decided how much that was going to be limited just to state-based exchanges, and the court felt that it would not. And then in 2021, there was California versus Texas, in which the Supreme Court upheld the ACA, even though the penalty for the individual mandate had been changed by law by Congress and President Trump to $0. So those were the three big legal challenges to the law as a whole, and it has stood up at the Supreme Court each time, although there have been some changes, as with the Medicaid expansion. The next slide, we'll talk about some ACA legal challenges that were more targeted. And the targets of these legal challenges, and the ones I'll talk about on the next slide as well, really have to do with the preventive coverage mandate and how broad that is and what's included in it. So in 2014, there was the case of Burwell versus Hobby Lobby, in which the Supreme Court struck down the contraceptive mandate for religious private employers. They did not have to cover contraceptives at no cost sharing under the preventive coverage mandate if they were religious employers. In 2016, in the case of Zubik versus Burwell, it was a religious exemption case that was actually remanded by the court, sent back to the lower courts. And then in 2020, Trump versus Pennsylvania, the result of that case was that Health and Human Services could exempt religious employers from the contraceptive mandate. So all of these were around contraception, but they really concerned the preventive coverage mandate. And you can see that in the case that was just heard this week, there was another aspect of preventive coverage that has been challenged. Really, the challenges have turned. We have these cases that have been heard before the Supreme Court. There are not as many challenges to the law as a whole anymore. The challenges have been more successful on the preventive coverage mandate, and so what we're seeing now are more changes to the preventive coverage mandate. So the ACA requires coverage of preventive health services with no cost sharing, but it doesn't define what preventive health services are. And the law gives the U.S. Preventive Service Task Force, which is a panel of about 15 independent expert volunteers, the power to determine what preventive health services are. So in 2019, the task force recommended coverage without cost sharing for a drug regimen called PrEP, which is highly effective at preventing HIV infection. The case that was heard before the Supreme Court this week, Kennedy versus Braidwood Management. In that case, plaintiffs are 4 individuals and 2 small businesses that have religious objections to the PrEP drug treatment requirement, and are, instead of just challenging that particular requirement, are also challenging the constitutionality of this task force entirely. with a potential result that if the Supreme Court agrees with them, the entire preventive coverage mandate is open to being found unconstitutional. So it has a potential to end the preventive services mandate. Most observers of oral argument this week don't believe that the Supreme Court is poised to get rid of the preventive coverage mandate. The justices seemed to not be leaning toward that argument, but we won't have a decision from the court until probably May or June. With that, let's talk a little bit about the changes that have been made to the ACA since it was enacted. So first of all, the Cadillac tax. Those of you who have been doing benefits work for a while remember this. It was nicknamed the Cadillac tax. It was a 40% excise tax on so-called high-cost health plans. At the time, it was $10,200 for a single person, $27,500 for a family, paid by both the employer and the employee, and that it was indexed to inflation, so it would increase every year with inflation. The intent of this tax on the value of health insurance above these thresholds was to, one, discourage overutilization of healthcare services. Two, to cap the tax exclusion for health insurance payments. And three, to use the revenue from the tax to cover other ACA provisions that, were budgeted. So the problem with this is that it is deeply unpopular to tax health insurance, and the implementation date kept being pushed back. There was a lot of concern that because of the way it was indexed to inflation and the fact that medical inflation rises so much more quickly and more steeply than the rest of inflation, that it would become sort of a Chevy tax over time, that it would not just affect those with super deluxe plans, that it would impact most Americans with health coverage. So a 2019 Kaiser Family Foundation analysis determined that 1 in 5 employers would have had at least one plan subject to the tax in 2022, and that would have increased by 2030 to 1 in 3. So the upshot was that the Cadillac tax was repealed in 2019, along with a medical device tax that had also been part of the ACA. Another change that I mentioned a few minutes ago was the individual mandate. So under the individual mandate, uninsured individuals were to pay a tax penalty of the greater of $695 a year, up to $2,085 per family, or 2.5% of household income for failing to have health insurance during the year. There was an annual cost of living increase for the penalty, and there were exemptions in the law for people with very low income. The individual mandate was intended to be a counterweight to guaranteed issue and limits on medical underwriting, essentially to make healthy people sign up when the insurance became available rather than wait until they got sick. It has always been politically controversial, and as I mentioned before, the legislation was enacted in 2019 that reduced the penalty for the individual mandate to $0. So while there's still technically an individual mandate on the books, there is no penalty for failing to carry insurance as an individual. Marketplace subsidies. So the coverage on the individual market bought through state or federal marketplaces was subject to tax subsidies. There is in the law a subsidy cliff at 400% of the federal poverty level, which meant that many middle income people have been priced out of ACA coverage because they are not getting that subsidy that would make it affordable for them. In 2021, Congress enacted the American Rescue Plan Act, which was signed into law by President Biden. It it put in place it was a COVID-19 relief plan essentially, and it expanded eligibility subsidies. It expanded the eligibility criteria for subsidies to people with incomes over 400% of the federal poverty level that are buying their health coverage on the marketplace. It also increased the amount of the subsidy to those who are already eligible under the ACA. Now it was extended by the Inflation Reduction Act to the end of 2025, this year. And those marketplace subsidies will expire at the end of this year, absent legislation to extend them further. This subsidy increase helped to more than double exchange enrollment in the years that it was on the books, to about 24.3 million in 2025. And so the big question is, will Congress extend it again? It would cost probably about $335 billion over 10 years to extend the enhanced credits. But out-of-pocket premiums will rise by more than 75% on average if they're not extended. There's some feeling in Washington that if Congress didn't want to have that kind of shock to the individual market, that it could maybe kick the can down the road, extend the credits by a year or two, basically addressing the political risk of ending these marketplace subsidies while minimizing the cost. It remains to be seen how that will be addressed. Cost sharing reduction payments. Under the ACA, insurers are required to reduce cost sharing for low income enrollees in the individual market. And the federal government is required to reimburse insurers for cost sharing reductions. Essentially, the funds were never appropriated. And the Trump administration the first Trump administration ended the federal CSR payments to insurers in 2017. The CBO estimated termination of CSR payments would increase the federal deficit by about $194 billion over 10 years because of the higher premiums and corresponding increase in premium tax subsidies. Medicaid expansion. So the ACA originally expanded eligibility for Medicaid to all individuals under 65 with incomes up to 138% of the federal poverty level. And the federal government, under that expansion, reimburses states 90% of the costs of expansion. As I told you earlier, in the case of NFIB versus Sebelius, the court upheld the Medicaid expansion, but limited the ability of HHS to enforce it, and essentially made the decision to expand Medicaid effectively optional for the states. As of now, 40 states plus the District of Columbia have expanded Medicaid. The Independent Payment Advisory Board is not something we think about a lot anymore. It is a board of 15 Senate-confirmed appointees who were supposed to recommend cuts to Medicare spending when cost growth exceeds targets. The Obama administration never nominated board members. The HHS secretary had that power in the absence of the board, but this is a provision that never got off the ground and was repealed in 2018. And the last thing that has changed quite a bit about the ACA since it was enacted is public opinion. This Kaiser Family Foundation health tracking poll result shows the public's view on the ACA changing over time, being moderately accepted in the beginning, really losing popularity, and then really gaining popularity to the point that now, as of January of 2025, among all adults, the favorable result is at 64%. There were also some provisions in the ACA that are still on the books but were never implemented. These orphan provisions include the Section 105H non-discrimination rules being applied to fully insured plans. That has never really been put into effect. The Class Act, which was a public voluntary insurance plan that would help pay for supportive services to enable individuals with mild functional limitations to remain in the community rather than enter into nursing homes, also never ever put into effect. And lastly, cooperative health plans, which were supposed to be an alternative to insurance on the exchange in the individual market, nonprofit member-governed health plans. And while there were some moves toward that early on, they never really took off either. So the question becomes, where are we? What does the ACA look like now? So let's go back for a second to the goals that we talked about at the beginning. The goals of the Affordable Care Act were to increase access to health insurance and reduce the numbers of the uninsured, to slow the growth of healthcare costs, both the cost of coverage and out-of-pocket costs, and to improve the quality of care, both raise the quality of coverage offered through the group and individual market and improve health outcomes. So how did we do? Well, on access to care, we've greatly lowered the number of uninsured Americans. We went from an uninsured rate close to 20%, down to, on this slide, it's down to 9.5%, and the projected uninsurance rate for 2025 is 7.6%. So many more people became covered under insurance through the ACA, including people who are able to get coverage in the individual market, people who are offered coverage by their employers, and then people who obtained coverage through Medicaid. As you can see, the uninsured rates have dropped somewhat unevenly among states. You can see Texas is the big dark state there, and to a certain extent, the states that saw less of a change in their uninsured rates are also the states that did not expand Medicaid. So those are very closely correlated. Have we improved the quality of care? Well, the individual market coverage is much more comprehensive than it was pre-ACA. So that is one way in which the quality of coverage has improved. Coverage has also become more regulated across marketplaces for the fully insured. In terms of improving the quality of care, there is some evidence that the preventive care provisions have improved some aspects of care. So there have been moderate increases in HPV vaccination or colorectal cancer screenings, a small increase in influenza vaccinations and well child visits. Mammography rates have increased since the ACA went into effect. But the truth is that, as I mentioned before, preventive care continues to be intensely political. What about costs? Well, healthcare spending still represents about 17% of the US economy, and it's actually projected to go to 20% by 2030. 17% is where we were when the ACA was enacted as well. That's almost $1 in every 5 spent in the US that goes to healthcare. If you compare this to 1960, healthcare spending represented 5% of GDP, and it's headed toward 20% of GDP now. So healthcare costs really have not been brought down at all due to the ACA writ large, while maybe costs for some individuals have come down through subsidies and other measures. Similarly, out-of-pocket spending continues to rise. So in 1970, out-of-pocket spending among Americans was at $115, and that in 2022 dollars is about $677. In 2022, that went up to over $1,000. $1,425 per person. So while the cost of coverage continues to go up, out-of-pocket costs continue to go up. This figure is the average annual premium for single and family coverage from is that 99 to 2024, and you can see it has just continued to go up. So the ACA has had an impact on coverage, certainly. It has had some impact on quality. It seems to have had very little, if any, impact on healthcare costs. So with that in mind, what does that mean for the next 15 years? Well, I don't have a crystal ball. I can't give you a guarantee of what's going to happen in 15 years, but I can talk to you a little bit about what things look like in the next 4 years. First of all, on March 17th, CMS, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, released proposed rules to address alleged fraud in the marketplace enrollments and to make other changes to the individual market plans. These rules would end the special enrollment period for those making below 150% of federal poverty, and that's at $23,475 for a single person, $48,225 for a family of 4. The rules would require additional pre-enrollment verification of eligibility and income verification when there's no tax data available regarding the participant in the plan. It would reduce the subsidy for those who don't regularly confirm or update their eligibility verification, and it would shorten the regular exchange open enrollment period. Basically, it would roll back all of the actions that were taken during COVID and afterward that increased the number of people that had coverage in the individual market. Additionally, these proposed rules would change how the ACA's applicable percentages and maximum out-of-pocket limits are adjusted each year. Now, the applicable percentages determine the share of income that families are expected to pay for a benchmark plan, which is the second lowest cost silver plan on the health coverage in the marketplace. So this doesn't have a direct impact on employer-provided group health plans. However, additionally, the maximum out-of-pocket limit would be changed, and that limit establishes the maximum amount that people can be required to pay in cost sharing, including deductibles, copays, or insurance. And that applies to nearly all private plans, whether offered through employers or through the individual market. The bottom line is that it is expected that each of these changes is expected to result in a 4.5% higher rate than in 2026 than was expected before the rules. The proposed marketplace regulations would also allow carriers to offer plans with a lower actuarial value on the exchange. Now, the actuarial value is the portion of medical costs that the plan typically covers, as opposed to the costs that the enrollee pays through copayments. And exchange plans are tiered by actuarial value. And so a bronze plan, which covers less, is 60%, has a 60% actuarial value. A silver plan has a 70% actuarial value. Gold is 80%, and platinum is 90%. Under the current rules, carriers are allowed to offer plans that have a slightly lower actuarial value as long as that amount is a de minimis amount, 0 to 2 percentage points. It can vary. The proposed rule that's now under consideration would allow some plans' actuarial value to drop by as much as 4 percentage points. The result of this would lower the value of those plans, as well as lower the premium credit amounts that people are allowed to get through the marketplace premium subsidies because they're tied to the value of the benchmark plan. Supporters assert that this proposal will lower ACA premiums by 5% or more and reduce improper enrollment by 1 million or more people and reduce deficits by $150 billion over a decade. Opponents of these changes think that they will erode the value of these marketplace plans, cover less and result in fewer people having health insurance coverage. What we're also seeing during this first 100 days of the second Trump administration is ACA customer service cuts. So Health and Human Services has cut 2 out of 6 divisions of exchange caseworkers, and it has cut the navigator funding for people that help people navigate the exchange by 90%. Now, this isn't new. Similar cuts to customer service and more onerous enrollment rules went into effect during the first Trump administration as well. What we saw during that administration was that those changes basically led to flat exchange growth during the first Trump administration. So while enrollment of people who are getting access to coverage in the individual market grew from enactment until the Trump administration, it was flat across the first Trump administration. So we could expect to see something similar in the next few years. Another thing that is happening right now is that the subsidies are expiring. And it remains to be seen whether Congress will do anything to extend them. The Commonwealth Fund predicts that 4 million people will lose coverage as a result of the expiring of the enhanced subsidies. This will put additional budget pressure on states like California, Washington, Colorado, Maryland that have added to the expansion of Medicaid. But there's also a real impact for red states that expanded enrollment in between 2020 and 2025. Texas enrollment on the in Medicaid went up 255% in that time. Florida's enrollment went up 147%. So while this feels like an issue that would be very red and blue, Republican and Democrat, it may in fact skew differently because of the interests of the states that are, there are 40 states now that have enhanced their Medicaid program. So where are we on 50-state Medicaid expansion? There are 10 states that have not yet expanded Medicaid under the ACA. And in some of those states, there are efforts underway to expand Medicaid. So in Florida, there is an initiative to put Medicaid expansion on the 2026 ballot. Georgia is seeking to extend or renew its Section 115 pathways to coverage waiver, and we're going to talk about the coverage waivers in a minute. In Kansas, the Democratic governor, Laura Kelly, included Medicaid expansion in her proposed fiscal year 2026 budget. Mississippi had legislation in 2024 to expand that failed. South Carolina is also seeking a limited coverage expansion to 100% of federal poverty and with a work requirement. The Wisconsin governor proposed an expansion in his biennial budget proposal for 25-27. There are no actions in the last year or so in Wyoming, Alabama, Texas, and Tennessee. So state waivers. State waivers give states the opportunity to take on that laboratory of democracy role. So they are making changes that customize a little bit what the states do in 2 areas. So there are 2 waiver laws. There's ACA Section 1332 and Medicaid Section 1115. So Section 1332, those are state demonstration waivers under the ACA, and they allow states to opt out of certain marketplace requirements in favor of alternative solutions that provide coverage at least as comprehensive as essential health benefits under the ACA, at least as affordable as what ACA subsidies and cost-sharing protections offer, cover a comparable number of people, and don't increase the federal deficit. So that's those areas where states may be able to be creative, make changes, and still have get a waiver under the ACA. They are coming back to a certain extent. And we'll see what happens in the next few years. Also, Section 1115, Medicaid demonstration waivers allow states an avenue to test new approaches to Medicaid that differ from the federal requirements if the approach is likely to promote the objectives of the Medicaid program. What we're seeing in Section 115 waivers is states enacting work requirements for Medicaid, and there have been a number of states that have introduced work requirements for Medicaid in recent months. We're also seeing a potential, at least a potential look at the Cadillac Tax 2.0. So in March of last year, the Republican Study Committee's Budget and Spending Task Force released a budget proposal which included a limit on the tax treatment for healthcare expenditures, including the amounts paid by both an employer and an employee. So the question is, what would happen if the tax exclusion for employer-sponsored insurance was capped at, say, 75% of the average in 2026, and then indexed for inflation? All of this should sound familiar. It's very similar to the Cadillac tax idea. This has been studied, and by 2032, the policy would probably limit the tax exclusion to the 50th percentile of premiums. Again, it would get right down to that Chevy tax at $8,900 per individual and $21,600 per family. The result of that could be 2.8 million fewer people that would have coverage through employment by 2035, and a move toward less robust coverage as employers made their coverage less expansive to stay under the cap. Other long-run impacts could include $40 billion less annually in GDP, 240,000 fewer jobs, and $280 billion less in after-tax employee compensation. Section 1557. This is an area where we're going to see some change. The ACA, this is the ACA's non-discrimination provision, which, among other things, prohibits discrimination in health coverage on the basis of sex. And that's the area where there's been the most controversy. So it became effective upon enactment in 2010, but the breadth of the law has been really determined through implementation guidance issued across different presidential administrations. So Obama in 2016, Trump in 2020, and Biden in 2024. Those pieces of regulatory guidance were issued. So there are two main areas of disagreement. One of them is protections for pregnancy-related decisions, including abortion, and protections for transgender people, especially in light of the Supreme Court decision under the Bostock versus Clayton County. So this is an area where I see the Trump administration moving back toward its prior rule. It has already taken some steps in that direction. So I think we will be going back to the Trump rules circa 2020 under Section 1557. So finally, what's going to impact the ACA over the next 15 years? First of all, access to health insurance and the number of the uninsured, right? Certainly the impact of the expected massive cuts to the federal budget. If there are enormous cuts, what will that be in terms of subsidies and access. There are 12 states right now that have trigger laws regarding the federal government falling below the 90% federal Medicaid match, which means that if the federal government reneges on its promise, goes below 90%, those states automatically pull out of the expanded Medicaid, and the number of people that are eligible for Medicaid in those states plummets. Also, the growth of healthcare costs, right? We have had a rapidly expanding increase in the price of prescription drugs and non-preventive treatment. So the growth of healthcare costs is certainly going to impact how we deal with health policy and what happens with the ACA over the next 15 years. And the quality of care. Right. So the effect of AI or medical professional shortages. So those are some of the things that will impact the quality. It will impact the ACA over the next 15 years. They're actually aspects of the goals that we talked about in the beginning, access to insurance and lowering the number of the uninsured, lowering the cost of healthcare or keeping a cap on the cost of healthcare, and improving the quality of care. So we're still looking at the same three goals. How the ACA rises or falls really will still depend in part on how it meets that moment or how the moment changes. And the last piece I would talk about is anger. There's enormous amounts of political anger, I think. So it remains to be seen, in what direction that anger turns. But certainly there was, the ACA has been quite the flashpoint over time, and aspects of it still are. And that level of consternation certainly has had an impact on how that law has been implemented. So I appear to be ahead of time, so I'm going to ask if there are any questions, but first I'm going to read our disclaimer. Accretive companies are insurance brokerage and consulting firms. We're not law firms, and we're not accounting firms. We do not give legal advice or tax advice, and neither this presentation, the answers provided during the Q&A period, nor the documents accompanying this presentation constitute or should be constructed as legal or tax advice. You are advised to follow up with your own legal counsel and/or your tax advisor to discuss how this information affects you. So with that, I'm going to see if there are any questions in the chat.
Amy, while you're looking at that, I just want to remind everyone that, yes, this was recorded. We will be posting it on the Accretive and Keenan sites, as well as some of the other Accretive agencies sites. And you will be emailed once that recording is available. Besides, Amy, there's a question there. One of the questions that was put into the chat was, will the Cadillac tax 2.0 include the 40% excise tax?
That is an idea that's been batted around. I think there are two. No, I don't think the 40% excise tax is something that has been brought up recently. I think it is the idea has been configured a little bit differently, and that is to say that this is merely an idea that's in Washington, not something I'm saying is going to happen. But it's an idea that keeps coming up over time, which we always pay attention to, where the same ideas get recycled in different forms.
And it's important to point out that you and I went through this together back in 2009 when this was first all being introduced. I think we both read all, if not close to all, of the legislation that was being proposed. And there was a lot of webinars that we ran back then, and we pointed out there are things on paper now that never materialize, and you pointed that out in some of the unrealized regulations that were proposed. So we make a pledge out to all of our clients and our audience that we do the best we can to present webinars as soon as there's information that's important. So we're presenting this now. We have this ongoing webinar series. We will continue to bring up all these issues as they emerge and let you know what's important, what you should pay attention to.
Yeah. I see another question in there. Somebody asked, is there any truth that the ACA caused the private health plans to increase? Wow, that's a big question. Let me see if I can tackle it a little bit. I think what the person was asking was the cost of private health plans. And I'm going to talk about the cost of health plans offered through the marketplace, which has been a real area of some problems for people. People who thought they would be able to afford coverage have not been able to. Certainly, because of the quality of coverage provisions that were part of the ACA, individual coverage became a lot more robust in terms of what is covered. And at the same time, health insurance companies were given a lot less leeway in when they could terminate or not offer coverage to people who had pre-existing conditions. So I think I think there are researchers out there who could make a compelling case that coverage available through the private market became more expensive because of those provisions. I think there are people on the other side who would say that people are getting better value for their money in that marketplace because of the same provisions. So I think it's a really complicated and interesting question, but that remains to be seen.
Another question that popped up into the chat was, does this mean we need to continue the ACA 1095C report for the IRS?
Boy, I would love it if that were the case. So far, no. So far, nobody's telling us that we don't need to file a 1095C forms anymore. We asked that question. I'm in Washington several times a year meeting with other lawyers in the insurance industry, and that is a question that gets raised by my colleagues perennially. And so far, nobody in Washington seems inclined to tell us that they don't need those forms. So sorry about that.
Amy, thank you so much for your time today and your preparation. I've been fortunate to sit with you for so many years and learn a tremendous amount about what's happening in the employee benefits world. So thank you for all your effort today.
Thank you.
And thank you everyone for joining us. We look forward to seeing you on our next webinar.